Welcome to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, number 37. From Trauma to an Initiation Culture, a conversation with Manda Scott. In today's episode, we delve into the heart of regenerative thinking, exploring how we can transform our world amidst a complex meta-crisis. With environmental degradation, social upheaval, and economic instability, our conversation today addresses the urgent need to reimagine our systems and ourselves. How do we transition from a trauma-based culture to one of initiation and healing? How do we foster communities that are resilient, connected, and oriented toward a sustainable future? Our guest today, Manda Scott, brings profound insights into these questions. Manda is a visionary author, shamanic practitioner, and founder of Accidental Gods podcast. Her work focuses on creating a pathway to what Indy Johar of Dark Matter Labs calls interbecoming, where technology and spirituality intertwine to reconnect us with the living world. Through her platform, Manda offers meditations and visualizations designed to help individuals rediscover their inherent connection to nature and their role in the universe's unfolding wonder. Manda's journey began with a series of profound visions in 2018, leading her to establish the Accidental Gods podcast and membership program. She's also a celebrated author with a diverse portfolio, including historical fiction and mythological thrillers. Her latest book, Any Human Power, explores the intersection of shamanism, politics, and future thinking, providing a narrative blueprint for a world we could be proud to leave for future generations. We extend our gratitude to the Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action for sponsoring this podcast. These organizations are dedicated to mobilizing elders to address climate change and promote social justice. The Elders Action Network focuses on creating sustainable and just world for future generations through advocacy, education, and community building. Elders Climate Action works on empowering elders to take action on climate change, recognizing the unique role that older generations can play in fostering a livable planet. Thank you for joining us on this journey toward a regenerative future. And now for our hosts, Dr. John Izu and Jim Burke.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alon Gauthier, and our producer, Jim Burke, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, where, as you know, we explore issues and ideas about the future of humanity and planet, especially from the perspective of those over 50 and how we can live both purposeful lives and contribute to a better world for all of us. So welcome. It's great to have you here. And Alon is actually in France. Lucky him, as many of you know from his accent, he is from France. And so Jim is joining us today. So Jim, thanks for co-hosting today. Good to see you. So Jim, as I think about our topic today, which we're going to be talking about some concept people may not be familiar with, which is Through-topian literature. And we won't get to what that is yet. Give you a little kind of teaser if you don't know what it is. We know dystopian, we know utopian, but there's another genre, Through-topia, which our guest today is just written a new book in that genre, one of many books that she's written. But I was thinking about this podcast, Jim, and so much of our time has been spent thinking about where is the future going and how are we going to get there. And I was thinking about a professor friend of mine at the University of British Columbia who teaches sustainability. And he, in the middle of his freshman class on sustainability, he was going on and on. And there was one kid in the class who had not said anything for the whole semester. It was 3/4 of the way through the semester. He had not said one single word until finally he raised his hand. And my professor friend was, wow, he's got something to say. And he said, I know what your problem is, man. And he goes, okay, what's my problem? He says, your problem is that you have an imagination problem. He said, you're talking about all the things that are wrong with the world, all the things that aren't working, but you have no imagination about what the world would look like different than the one we have. Maybe if you did that, you'd make some progress. The kid never said another word the rest of the class, but my professor friend was haunted. And I'm haunted by that question. I think, Jim, of earlier, about 6 months ago, we talked about Jim Bendel's book, Breaking Together, a freedom-loving response to collapse. And I probably didn't agree with the two of you. I felt the book kind of depressing because I felt like rather than really create a vision of where we could go or how we could get through this, I felt like in many ways he was kind of saying, we're hooped, let's raise the white flag and be really loving while we get there. And so anyway, I'm excited about the conversation today with Manda Scott. So Manda, welcome into the podcast studio. Great to have you here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
And Manda, you're coming to us from where this morning?
It's a place called Shropshire, which is the west of the UK, right next to Wales. One of those places you don't want to have to say if they're asking you if you're drunk when the police stop you in your car. You say something else.
That's funny.
York.
Well,
York,
you may be able
York.
to tell from her accent that she has a bit of a brogue. So
Yes,
she's
thank you.
Scott.
Originally from Scotland, for sure. Yes. One day
I
we'll
grew
get
up in a
independence.
first-generation Presbyterian church in New York City, filled with tons of first-generation Scots. So I grew up listening to brogues from the pulpit.
Right.
So.
Yes, good man.
So, Amanda, let's start there. And then I want to back into your history and how you became an author and got into this. But what is Throughtopian literature? What is it in a nutshell?
It's Throughtopia that takes us through from exactly where we are to a future that we would be proud to leave to the generations that come after us, in its absolute nutshell. The phrase was coined by Professor Rupert Reed, who wrote an article in the Huffington Post back in 2017. He has a very slightly different spin on it, but he and I work together a lot now. And it's through, spelled THREU, Topia. So it's like utopia, but with the through bit. For exactly as you said, dystopias, we don't need any more people telling us what it's going to look like when the road crashes into A Handmaid's Tale. We all know that. I think people who are interested in permaculture will have a sense of the truth that where we put our energy is where we get to. But similarly, utopias are utopic. And the point is, you never see how you get there. There's just this amazing, beautiful place where the unicorns are skipping through the bluebells and everybody thinks like we do, whoever we are who are writing the utopia, and it's beautiful and lovely. But we need to see the path. We need to see the route to get to somewhere that feels as if that path is real. It's grounded in a reality that we understand. It's achievable. It may be hard. No one is suggesting that this is going to be a walkover, but it's doable. And it's taking us somewhere we would all want to go. So that, in a nutshell.
Great teaser. Profound. I'll ask you later about your response to some who have gone down the more dystopian route. But for now, tell us about yourself. I know you were in veterinary medicine, and how did that morph into a career as a writer and to this latest book that you've written?
Slowly, basically. It was not an overnight experience. It comes down to my spiritual path is shamanic. I take all of my guidance from that. And I loved being a vet. I was a clinical anaesthetist, on your side of the Atlantic, that would be anesthesiologist. The University of Cambridge, I absolutely loved what I was doing. I specialised in horses. I had been in Newmarket, which is fairly nearby, where all the racehorses are, doing neonatal foals. And it was all lovely. And this was back in the 80s, when the climate emergency was something that was going to happen to 3 or 4 generations down the line. And we were a bit concerned, but we weren't that concerned. And I just got to the point where it wasn't taking me where I felt I needed to go. And I did the shamanic work. And what came up was you need to be writing stuff. And I wrote crime novels to begin with because it didn't take me any research. I could write them really out of what I already knew. And then there was another shamanic event that, probably too much detail for your listeners, that put me on to writing the Boudica Dreaming series, which was my attempt to describe in the islands of Britain, our indigenous shamanic past, which ended when the Romans came. And everyone else who'd written about the Boudican revolt wrote about the Roman invasion and onwards. And I really wanted to look at who we were before the Romans came, on the basis that I would go around the country. We did literary events in those days and people actually turned up. I would say, this is who we were and this is who we could be. my thesis was and remains actually that we are in the dying days of the Roman Empire, that the Roman value system, basically see, want, take, whoever has the biggest bludgeon, stroke swords, strokes legions, wins and takes everything they want, and the repercussions on everything else don't matter. That is still the foundation of the trauma culture that we inhabit. And it doesn't have to be. And it wasn't. For nearly 300,000 years of human evolution, that was not the path that we took. And I don't want to take us back, but I want us to evolve what would a healed and whole, what Francis Weller calls an initiation culture. What would the value system of that look like? And how do we get to it? But I didn't really know that when I was writing the Boudica books. I was easing towards that, but I was really just trying to show what the islands of Britain looked like when we were whole. And then from that evolved writing a lot of historical stuff, just because it was fun and it was exciting. And I set up the Historical Writers Association, and it was all, look, guys, the past is not what you thought it was. There's a concept that's beginning to gain traction now of epistemicide, which is the kind of cultural annihilation of stories. And I wanted to bring out the stories that I thought needed to be heard. So way down the line from the Boudica books, I think I know who Joan of Arc really was, for instance, and it's not what history has told us at all. So I wrote a book because fiction is a really good way to help people to come to grips with quite complex ideas without them feeling like they're reading a textbook. Until we got to the point where it was obvious that I needed to look forward and not look back, which is where we are now.
And the new book is called Any Human Power, correct?
Yes.
And I want to come back to this trauma culture versus initiation culture, because I think it's quite important. I really loved your comment that, in fact, let's go down this path, then we'll talk about the book. You said the Roman Empire values have continued to really guide human history. I would agree with that point. Talk about what you mean by a trauma culture versus an initiation culture.
So this is an idea that I have lifted wholesale from Francis Weller. So if you want the detail, you need to go to him. And he was very influenced by two things. First of all, he's a trauma therapist. And second, he learned a lot from Malidoma Somé, who wrote the book Of Water and the Spirit. So those two things were informing the basis of this. So Francis Weller's thesis is that for almost all of human history, and still in cultures around the world that are not the hegemonic trauma culture, these are based on initiation culture, whereby humans, people, go through initiatory cycles, rites of passage, which are, in his words, contained encounters with death. And the importance is the container, the containment of these. And the containment is held by the elders, the wise people, often the shamans of the culture, by the tribe within which one has grown, and with the whole serotonin mesh of tribal connection that is what we're born seeking. It's also held by the land. And if you're in a particular culture that adheres to ancestor continuation, it's held by the ancestors. And in the process of that contained encounter with death, if we survive it, we reach the edges of ourselves. We find out who we are in extremis. We also find out how to ask for help from the elders, the land, our culture, the ancestors, in ways that are meaningful to us and that we can carry forward. And we come back to our culture, to our tribe, to our land, to our elders as a new person with greater insights, if we survive. We don't necessarily survive. Not all contained encounters with death are survived. Birth is a contained encounter with death on both sides, for the mother and the child. Death is a contained encounter with death if it's held within one of these cultures, and you move on to whatever comes next. But that's also part of an initiatory cycle for which we have prepared. So all of this happens in what I would consider to be whole, healed cultures. It's our birthright as human beings. 300,000 years of human evolution and 64 million years since the last mass extinction, we've been working towards this. Trauma cultures have no containment for our encounters with death. We're not held. We're not allowed to grow. We're not given the space to grow. We just stack traumas on top of each other, and trigger stacking is a concept within human and animal behavior therapy now, until we overflow, at which point we don't cope anymore. And mental illness and not coping is endemic, and I would say pretty close to being the signifier of our culture. And so my question then is, what would it take for our culture to move from being a trauma culture to being an initiation culture? And there's a kind of a self-reinforcing loop there of we need to change our value system, but we need to be a whole culture in order to be able to change our value system. And I think both of these need to come together. Sorry, that was quite lengthy.
Well, Amanda, what's really interesting is when you talk about trauma culture, part of what I did for a living is I spent 10 years on a trauma unit treating the worst cases of trauma, initially from Vietnam, then from Afghanistan and from Iraq. So one of the things that struck me, though, is how do you imagine as we move into the future, as we deal with the meta crisis, what do you imagine the initiation? And when you look at that, what would that look like for the future? What kind of initiation rites or process do we need? What do you imagine that looks like as we move forward to move from the trauma culture to the initiation in the future?
Yeah, really good question.
I did ULab with the President Institute. One of the things I came out of that with is that we don't know what it is to be an elder in the 21st century.
But I think we already have people giving us models.
We need a new model because this group of elders is the longest living, the best educated, and actually the wealthiest. So going back to my initial question, what does the initiation rites that the elders need to offer the younger people look like in the future?
Okay, we could spend the rest of the podcast on this, so I'm just flagging that up. And I think that would be a really useful thing. I think this is the single most important thing. How do we become good ancestors would be another way of framing this, or good enough ancestors. And I just watched, it's not yet released, but a video with Audrey Tang, who was the digital minister of Taiwan. If you haven't spoken to her, you definitely need to. And the title of this video piece that will be coming out is Good Enough Ancestors. So there are two ways into this. One is my absolute belief. As part of our trauma, we have created a reverse stack where we put our head minds above our heart minds and both above our body minds. And we need to invert that. We need to listen. Our head minds are very, very good and are designed to work out how to do stuff. What they're not designed to do is to work out what to do. That needs to come from our heart minds. And we are incredibly bad at listening to authentic heart mind voice. One of my early teachers said the heart mind is very quiet, it's very shy. But the head mind will whisper if that's what it takes to be heard as the heart mind.
If you can give us a story describing how that happens.
We need to explain the concepts first. So in order to, I think, this is my belief system, first of all, and we'll explore the reasons why I believe it and why I think it's anchored in reality. We need to be able to listen to our heart minds. When we get to a point where we can balance on the knife edge of the moment in full heart mind ascendancy, which I believe Indigenous cultures around the world do automatically. If you ever meet Indigenous people, they live in this space and they're really confused at the point when they realize that we don't, and they don't get where we do. However, that's a separate conversation. We need to be able to do that, and I will explore in a minute how we get to that. But this achieves a number of things, one of which is it frees up our head minds from the sense of responsibility that our head minds have to work out where to go and know what to do. And neither of these is possible. One of the reasons we're in the place we're in is that our culture tells us that we can figure stuff out with our head minds. And our head minds are very good at complicated, linear thinking, cause and effect. We're extremely bad at complex systems in which there is no linearity, where a butterfly flaps its wings over here and there's a typhoon over there, and we cannot ever map how the one got to the other. We live in a complex world. Our heart minds are tuned to complexity. And once we can connect, so my belief is once we can balance on the knife edge of the moment, fully engaged with our heart minds, that is the point where our head minds just shut the fuck up. Am I allowed to say that on your podcast? They just quieten down and connect to the living web. And the living web is a complex system, and the living web knows where we need to go. And the living web will tell us how to craft whatever is appropriate in the moment. If I were to tell you what I think an initiation ceremony could look like, it is very likely not appropriate for the young people that you encounter in the time and the place where you encounter them. You need to go to a time and a place with them And you need to ask the questions of the web, and you need to be agile enough to act in real time to whatever is coming through you. And that takes a lot of practice. It takes, if we want to get head-mindy about it, we're in the world of Hebb's postulate, which I'm sure you knew from your PA work, was what fires together wires together. And we have networks in our mind that are very, very well trodden. This is the equivalent of going out into very, very, very thick forest and crafting a path through. And we need to walk it again and again and again until that path actually is there, because if we stay away for a couple of weeks, it'll be grown over again. We'll have to craft a way through again. And once we've crafted a way through a path that we've never been before, other paths will show up. And so anchoring this in reality, so this for me is what shamanic work is. It's learning to hone our own intent so that we can balance on the knife edge of the moment, connected to the all that is, to the web of life, to whatever you want to call the complex system of which we are a tiny part. The whole of my podcast, the membership program, and in the end, the book arose out of a series of visions. And there are two sets I want to tell you about because I think they're relevant. So the first was the spring equinox of 2016. I was teaching a course. It doesn't really matter. One of the shamanic courses, I woke up on the Sunday morning and I work with an altar space, which has certain things around the altar. The students come into the altar. It's a safe space to work. You don't need the detail of that. But I woke up and I go in the East Gate and I walk around and I check all the people around the altar, all the guides, the guards, the guardians. And it takes quite a while. And so I woke up about 5 and about probably 6:30, I got to the north. And what stands for me in the north is the horned god that was active in the old islands of Britain. And I connect to the god, which was, at that point, I worked with 2 primary guides. One of them was a very old ancestor, 10,000 generations back, who became the model for the elder grandmother in the Boudica books, and one was this god, so southeast and north. And I meet the god, and my standard thing is, how's everything? Is it safe in the altar? Are you okay? Is there anything we need to balance before tomorrow? And he said, yep, everything's fine, and now I'm leaving. You were doing what? And I was so confused. I was completely discombobulated. And no, you can't leave. We're teaching. You can't leave. I can't teach without you. And yeah, you can. I'm going, and that's what I'm going. No, but I can't. I need to follow you, and I can't because students. Let's be responsible people. We have integrity. We have our commitment to our students. He goes, that's why I'm going now, because you can't follow. What? Honestly, if I'd got home and found my partner packing a suitcase, I would have probably been less broken. Not that I wouldn't be broken, but I had worked with this guide for decades. So we got through the rest of that day. I don't think the students knew I was completely falling apart. But anyway, the next morning I got up. I was supposed to be going up the hill with a friend. We were going to walk our dogs together. And I phoned her up and said, I need the hill. Please don't come. Go somewhere else. I need the hill. Because this was the place where I used to do my night sits if I needed to sit through the night. And I went up the hill and I was following the usual path, me and the dog. And there was a path I'd never been on, Hebb's postulate, this new path. And there were red kites all the way along it. And red kites were just coming back into this area. I maybe saw 1 a month, and here were 6. So I was like, okay, I'm going on this path that I've never been on before. And I walked down the path, and there was a long avenue of beech trees, and it was spring, and the sun was coming through. And for us, the space of the heart mind is the color of a newly unfurled beech leaf with the sun coming through it. So this was north space. The north corresponds to the heart mind. And halfway along this path, there was a freshly dead deer hind. She was still warm, and she had been giving birth when she'd been killed by what looked like dogs that were not around. I touched her eyes. She was definitely dead, but she was very newly dead. And I completely disintegrated because this was a physical manifestation of something that was sacred to me. And this was not the first time that something that was sacred to me had died in my presence because I was not listening. So we tell the students 2 big questions you ask your guides. What can I learn from you? What can I do for you? So I put one hand on her forehead and one hand on her heart, and I spent about 2 hours just asking those. And in the end, she stood up in human animal form and said, I need to stand for you in the north. Well, you could just tell me that. You don't need to die to tell me this. And in the end, what she said was, we did need to do this because you wouldn't have listened. You were too bonded to the god. You were too busy doing all the stuff that you were doing that we don't need to go into in great detail. So I did what I was told. And as a direct result of that, I ended up doing a master's in economics. I was a vet who'd become a writer of history. I know nowhere in anywhere on any part of my radar was the concept of doing economics. I was, economics was a complete waste of time as far as I was concerned. It was totally in an urban space that had nothing to do with anything that I did. And it was a totally transformative experience. But if I had not followed the kites, if I had not spent the time with the body of a deer that clearly meant something to me, and if I had not let her come and stand in the north and do what she needed to do, I would never have ended up at Schumacher, and my life would be wholly different than it is just now. So I realize that probably took longer than you wanted to take. But I think the thing is, our culture, particularly now, we're used to dopamine hits. We're used to things being very fast. We're used to having to top them up very quickly because dopamine doesn't last. The point about serotonin mesh is that it's stable and enduring. The point about a dopamine fix is that it's neither of those things. So we need to move, I would say, from dopamine to serotonin. But how we do that is different to each community. And we can't start being prescriptive. We can give ideas of heart connection and sharing food and sharing land and sharing concepts, but actual heart being depends on the people involved.
What resonates with me is I'm a complexity theory person. I live my life by complexity. It's emergent in self-organization. And my job is to listen.
Yes.
And what I do is listen, and then I set intent, but I don't make things happen. I let them happen and get out of the way.
Right.
What you did is you listened there, and when it emerged, you followed it. I mean, I think that's one of the really difficulties in our culture is that too much trying to make things happen that we don't know why we're trying to make them happen.
Well, we do, but we don't know a lot of the geoengineering, I can't think of a word that I can safely say, nonsense that people are throwing up now. The one thing you can say with absolute certainty is that it will do a lot of things we didn't expect, and it probably won't achieve what we think we're doing.
Well, we're never prepared for unexpected consequences. I mean, that's happened every time we have a new technology. There's always unexpected consequences. And once again, I go back to listening, being open to the world and hearing what it has to say, and then sitting with it and trying not to make something happen, but to let it emerge. So I really resonate with what you're talking about, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to bring John back in here. Yep. He's been listening to us. What do you think, John?
Yeah, well, first I was thinking, Amanda, as you were talking about these experiences with the God in the north and the deer, that there'd be some people who are listening that they go, wow, that's like so out of my experience. But I feel like in some ways that's exactly what we've lost. The role of myth in our society, the role of mystery, the role of connectedness to nature, the sense of the god or gods, right? However we define that. And Joseph Campbell said we were in a very before he died, he said this was a very dangerous time for humanity because we were between myths. Yes. We really had no myth to guide us. And clearly humanism has tried to replace the myths of the past, which were all polluted anyway. Like Christianity is a great example, right? I grew up a Christian, a really loving, beautiful Christianity, I have to say. Mine was an embracing, nothing to recover from for me. But Jesus would hardly recognize what was done in his name over all these couple of millennia because it really was not in alignment with that teaching. What's the role of myth in the way forward for us?
It gives us the stories we can aspire to. So I am calling the new book a mytho-political thriller for exactly that reason. I think we need new myths. We need new myths that are predicated in a new value system. Myths are ways that we express what our value system is at its sharpest, at its best, at its most profound, with its greatest integrity, with whatever it is that feeds our serotonin mesh, our sense of pride, our sense of being and belonging, our sense of connectivity, our sense of what it is that we aspire to be. I think myths do all of that for us. And they do it by taking us out of our current setting and creating a space outside of time that allows us to play in that space. We're very good, our brains heart mind and head mind and body mind to an extent, are good at exploring other realities. I think this may be one of the things that sets humanity apart from some of the rest of the web of life. I'm pretty convinced that after a while we're going to find that the great whales and the great apes are actually in this space with us. I think my dogs are in this space with us. I dream of when I had dogs all the time. So it probably doesn't actually set us apart, but we know that we're in this space, or we know that we can access this space, and yet we choose not to, or we build mythology. I think a lot of what I find very problematic with current day media systems, particularly film, but also to an extent books, is that they're predicated on realities that don't allow for there to be alternatives. They're very left brain oriented. They're very stuck in what I would call the death cult of predatory capitalism, whereby he who dies with the most toys wins. They take that as a given. They don't challenge it. And why not? Because it's taking us over the edge of a cliff that we don't want to go over, and we could challenge it. We could create the movies or the books or the songs or the poetry that is throughtopian. I mean, it's hard. It is hard. I was about to say it's not hard, and that's completely not true. It's incredibly hard because you've got to start where we are and move at a pace that you think people will be able to follow until you get to an edge that is new. But I also think if we don't do that, we're not going to get through. So let's give it a go. Hey.
Yeah, one of the things you've said that really I've heard you say that struck me was, and I want you to talk about it, the system is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. Tell us about that.
Well, just exactly that. I think I hear a lot in our circles that the system is broken, and I would say no, the system is absolutely not broken. The system is designed to perpetuate the system, and the system is designed to elevate power, monetary power, but basically power in whatever, and value, to a very, very small number of the people at the top of a very steep-sided pyramid. And it's also designed to do that regardless of the impact on everything else in the biosphere, people or planet. The only thing that matters is shoveling value to the top. We have an economic system that is designed such that it has to grow. And it can't keep growing forever. Not only are we on a finite planet, we're also, in your country and mine, beset by politicians who don't understand where money comes from or what it does. There's a finite pot. Governments spend money into existence. Private banks lend money into existence. Actually, what private banks do is create money out of nothing and sell it to us as a profit. And we let them do that. And it was Henry Ford, who isn't really one of the most progressive people in the world, but he did say that if the general public ever understood the real function of banks and the creation of money, there would be riots and pitchforks on the streets. And he's right. And I still don't understand why people don't get this. And if your government, but definitely whoever comes into our government after the next election, is committed to spending less, which is to say to spending less money into existence, if the overall pot of money is going to continue to grow such that the banks can have their extra that they require as interest, that means more people have to take out personal debt. And there are very well-defined limits to how far they can continue to do that, particularly when the fossil fuel companies are ramping up the price of the thing that underlies everything and thereby creating inflation. Inflation is not created by giving people better wages. Inflation at the moment is being created by fossil fuel companies who are price gouging everybody. And so we're heading, I think, for another very, very major financial crash. We're already at a higher ratio of private debt to public debt than we were in 0809 when it all fell over before. So I think we're just teetering on the edge of waiting for it to all fall over again. The system is designed to perpetuate the system. We need a new system.
And it's as true in democracies as it is in even the people in power. Yes, there are some well-meaning people, but the system itself is designed to, in the United States, to keep two parties in power anytime. When Marianne Williamson, the author, this is an aside, but I think it's an example of what you're talking about. When Marianne Williamson was running for the Democratic nomination, there was one debate where in the 24 hours after that debate, she was the most Googled term in America. And she said in an interview I heard, she said the entire system of the Democratic machine dismantled her within 48 hours.
Right.
And because she was talking about a different paradigm, was not trauma culture based, that was not he who has the most toys wins, right?
Right.
And
Yep.
that system, even if it preaches, oh, well, we're here for everyone, the
No.
power structure said, no, we're not going to.
No.
So I wonder, and this kind of relates to, you talk a lot about community in your work, and I want to get to the novel in a few minutes. We're going to give you time to talk about that. Is you talk about the role of communities, and a lot of people are talking about the role of communities going forward. A couple of things I've heard you say that are interesting is we traditionally think of communities as very small and local. And, you talk about the Dunbar number from the British anthropologist who said that humans could have personal interactions or relationships with about 140 people. And it mirrors research that at about 140 to 50 tribes break down into sub-tribes. But you said something really profound. You said with technology, we have people breaking through that Dunbar number in exponential ways. So I have two questions for you. What's the role of local communities in our Thrutopian journey? Is it just, like some people are doing, I was talking to someone on an island recently here in British Columbia, said, well, we're trying to make sure we're sustainable and self-sufficient. If that's one role of community, and we're there for each other. But they also said we're trying to create a model of a different way we can respond to the crisis, right?
Right.
So what's the role of local communities and what's the role of the global community to counter perhaps that power structure? Because clearly counter may not be the right word, but to work around or through that power structure.
Okay, with that last sentence, we just opened it up quite a bit. So I see there being three types of communities. There's communities of place, communities of purpose, and communities of passion. And this is a Venn diagram, and they may all map onto each other, but they may also be quite disparate. But the person who will always be at the center of that Venn diagram is each individual is at the center of their own Venn diagram of these three. Communities of place are going to be central because we're physical beings, and we need to eat and sleep, and we want shelter, and we also I want to be able to have a house cow and share milk with my neighbor who has the sheep and knows how to make clothes, or the other neighbor who's really good at laying hedges. There's a lot of the older technologies that our great-great-grandparents lived with that we're going to need as we get through the carbon pulse. We're going to need basically to learn how to live with and on the land better. And I think there are ways whereby we can restructure our culture if we create a new system based on different values, whereby our relationship with power in all of its forms, so human power, electrical power, heat power, is evolving. And we could talk about that. Let's park that for a minute because that's communities of place. It's local. However, we have the internet. You guys are, if I had to travel by non-fossil fueled ways, it would take me many months to reach you two, and we're talking in real time. We can share passions of care for the land, for the web of life. We can share ideas. We can have communities of purpose, which are more related to, I'm a writer, it's part of my purpose. I can talk to writers all around the world. We have formed the Thrutopian Writers Association. We can share ideas of what Thrutopian writing is and does and how it can be and how it can get out into the world. We can share each other's writing. And I think often some of the relationships we can build online. So I used to play World of Warcraft. I'm in one of those. I've given it up, but I've given it up 5 times. So we can assume that this is probably not the final time I'm giving it up.
Thank you
and when I'm playing,
thank you for the confession.
well, I quite love it. I love it. I've been playing since it was vanilla. And I'm old enough to be at least the grandparent of most of the people I play with. They don't know that because they don't see me. They see my avatar. All they know is that I'm moderately good at healing battlegrounds. It's all I ever do. And so, but I have amongst these people that I've never met really strong bonds. When I've been in a battleground with someone, you get to know who you can trust. You get to know who knows their stuff, who understands their class, who understands the synergies between your class and their class, and also the anti-synergies between the classes that are coming at you. I know the tank that'll be able to fend off the rogue while I can keep them safe from the Ellie Shaman, whatever. It's big and it's real, and it reaches my heart space just as much as the person down the road whose husband just died, and we all supported while that was happening. And so as we move into a world that is not predicated on see, want, take, and is more predicated on how can we build connections with ourselves in the web of life. I am increasingly interested in, there's an amazing woman that you might want to talk to called Primavera de Filippi. She's in France. And she and Josh, whose surname will come, Josh Davila, who's from the Blockchain Socialist podcast, have a concept of coordinations. So coordi-nations, which is the progressive heart-based connected alternative to network nations, the Banerjee stuff, which is all as libertarian, not much fun. Libertarian, we're all straight white people who think the way we want to think and we're excluding everybody else. But coordinations are what they sound like. If I have a community of place and a purpose and a passion, and each of these, I think, can be a Dunbar number, thereby you get multiplications of Dunbar numbers and you can share amongst them. What happens if we connect with other groups who have similar values? So suppose we say we're interested in regenerative farming. We want a particular way of producing power. We use particular ways of healing and connecting. We have particular social technologies. Maybe we use sociocracy to help solve conflict because we're not going to be with that. Conflict is where we grow, the edge places where growth happens. But how do we resolve conflict in a way that is emotionally literate is really key to how a culture or a society builds. We are no longer limited by the Hobbesian concept of a nation. Hobbes had the concept of a nation, which is the political entity within whose geographic boundaries it claims monopoly, legal monopoly over violence. That, I think, need not be a thing. Joe Brewer is looking at creating boundaries that are much more bioregional, but we could have bioregional coordinations. There's whole new ways of assessing how do we have a sense of identity of this is my tribe. And in the end, my tribe needs to be the whole world. But if there are people who want to have their network nations where they don't want to pay tax because they don't actually like the idea that tax is useful and they don't understand how money works, frankly, but that's a separate conversation. If they want to do that, that's great. But we probably don't want to spend a lot of time in their company. I'm on Mastodon. It's a federated universe, and I don't get to see the fascists because the entire set of servers with which I am affiliated just doesn't have them in. They're just not there. And it's a much nicer place than Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it. So I think there are ways of looking at culture and community that are only possible because we have the technologies that we have. I'm reading Plurality at the moment, which is by Audrey Tang, who was the digital minister of Taiwan, and Glenn Weil, who created quadratic voting, which just leaves me awestruck because it's an extraordinary way. We were talking earlier about we have the best democracy money can buy, and it is utterly dysfunctional. And in the 21st century, there are so many better ways of creating distributed, people-based, consensus-based, democratic governance, even deciding what governance is for. We have, at the best, medieval institutions. This is the old E.O. Wilson quote of we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and the technology of gods, and this is not doing us a lot of favors. We need to grow up out of our Paleolithic emotions. We need to update our medieval institutions so they're fit for purpose in the 21st century. We need to do that urgently. And the existing system is predicated on the medieval institutions. So there's a lot of scope for change. We just need to sort out the value system that will allow it to happen.
Yeah, well, E.O. Wilson, had me at hello. I'm a big fan of his, and that's a beautiful quote, actually. I want to now give you a chance to talk about the book, Any Human Power, because, and again, I know it's because it's fiction, we don't want to spoiler alert, right? Just like a high level, but I'm going to ask you a question to answer in the context of what the book might suggest. And I confess I haven't had the chance to read the book yet. I often think of change as like a spider web. I do a lot of work in system change, and there's some strands you can pull and nothing really would happen. The spider web would still be intact, but there's a few strands that if you pull it, the whole web would come unraveled. And I'm curious, tell us about the book. And then I know the book is suggestive, not declarative, but what might the book suggest might be a couple of those strands that have to be pulled, if you will.
Yeah, good question. Really good question.
Get
Thank
to
you.
a different place.
Alrighty. So this is also, I would frame this through Donella Meadows' leverage points, which I think would be a similar thing. There are the leverage points that really don't change the system at all. And then there's the ascending grouping of leverage points. And the very top one is the second to top one, actually, is change the paradigm. And I came away from Schumacher where I learned about this. And I can change paradigms. That I can do. Let's get ahead and do that. That's what the podcast was set up to do. And it took me until I started writing the book to remember that the very top paradigm was abandon all paradigms. And I just somehow, I just managed to delete that because I didn't understand what it meant or how to do it. And now I understand more. Donella Meadows was clearly a genius, and I wish I had known her well enough to talk to. With that, I love your idea of the spider's web and the strands that we pull. I believe that whatever we do has to be peaceful. And so within the book, the book is a thriller, and it's a mytho-political thriller, and it's predicated on a number of things, but at heart, the political narrative arc, if you like, revolves around a tweet that a 14-year-old girl sends. And it's an actual tweet that was actually sent, but it was deleted very quickly. And then that kicks off a global movement, exactly as we've been speaking. If we had something that mattered enough to the under 40s, there is a global population that would come together behind this. And then what happens when the existing system pushes back? Exactly as you said, if somebody stands up against them, they're going to crush them if they possibly can. But what happens if you have enough people who are very good with technology and enough people who are very good at looking at the existing political system and seeing what can change? And one of the reasons I wrote the book, I was desperate for it to come out before a general election in the UK because I wanted time to embed these ideas, and the charming people at the top of the Tory party decided to call it right after the book was launched. So not happy. But anyway, so I think we need to use the existing system to break the existing system. And that means all coalescing around different candidates. In the US, you have the capacity to write somebody in, which we don't. We have to stand the candidates. So I think we need to get the idea out there that the current system is not broken, but is working not in anybody's favor except for the 0.1%. That we all have more in common than what divides us, and that we need to sit down together and speak across the tribal divides, find ways of coming together. Audrey Tang has some extraordinary software set up, Poll.is, to help people speak to support the bridging of divides. Our current social media system is designed to amplify difference, to amplify tribalism, to maximize the righteous outrage, that maximizes the dopamine drips, that maximizes our attention to the whatever software we're on so that they can sell us stuff. So, if you show me the incentives, I will show you the outcomes, and the incentives are the enrichment of the hedge funds, and the outcomes are outrage. What happens if we change the incentive structure? Very quickly. We need to do that urgently. We need to do it because people understand that they need to come off Twitter and off Snapchat, and perhaps if there's a potential for a group buyout of TikTok and turning it into something that's going forward, that might become a social medium that actually enhances people's lives. We need a new value system. We need to agree what our values are, and then at the moment, we have government by consent. We either fork the government the way they did in Taiwan, so we create a Go Zero, or we use the existing democratic system to elect a whole new group of people where we are bringing power to those with wisdom and wisdom to those with power. And I do not believe that the current system does either of those things. It's not even structured to do either of those things. So how do we find the people who have the wisdom? And how do we bring them into places of power? And I don't know anyone, certainly in the UK, watching the existing election happening, there's not a single person who thinks that either of the two main parties is actually going to do anything useful. What they don't understand is that there's an alternative, because we have a media hierarchy that is telling us there is no alternative. We're ditching the Tories. We're going to have Labour, who are utterly indistinguishable from the people they are going to replace. And in your country, I think, it seems to me, watching from the outside, there's a distinction between Trump and Biden, but not enough. Neither of them is going to get us through the meta crisis. And I can see that there would be an instinct to go for one, other than if you thought that would be the only way of stopping the other. But actually, we need neither. The option is none of the above. Who would you choose, and how would you elevate them? to be someone that could speak across the divides? And I don't know the answer to that, but I know that there's some very smart people thinking about it. So that we need to use the existing electoral system to change it. And once we've got different people in power, you change the nature of the voting system, you change the nature of what governance and democracy are, because we have 21st century technology and we have very, very bright people looking at how to work it. We have quadratic voting. We have the capacity to shape social media such that it brings people across divides. We have the capacity to create small Zoom rooms where you get 10 people who are absolutely guaranteed to have different value systems and different beliefs, but you bring them in and you facilitate them with social technologies that help them to find their commonalities and help them to craft ideas that they can all agree on. And then you bring those into governance. Distributed democracy is a thing. Participatory budgeting is a thing. All these things are happening in places around the planet. What we need is for them to be the hegemonic concept rather than the divisive politics of now. Sorry, that was very long.
No, it's okay. No, it's such good stuff that I don't want to gloss over all of it. I know one of the things I've heard, so I'll say a couple of things. One is, I love what you said about we need to use the existing system. And that's, even though it is flawed as it is, we know that in democracies, we do have the power, which we don't use, to change things,
exactly.
right? Ultimately, the voters do decide. Now, there's lots of system aligned for it not to work, but at the end of the day, we do have, especially locally, and that's why often change happens locally. I loved your idea, by the way, I heard you say about none of the above. And your idea was, if, let's say, the three of us were running and you'd also have none of the above, and if none of the above had more than us or any one of us, then all three of us go and you got to offer new candidates. So I love that.
Yes, but you have to have that with compulsory voting.
Yeah.
And I think compulsory voting is a possibility. But you giving the people the option of going, no, I don't want any of those. I'm going to vote, but I'm voting none. The Australians have compulsory voting. It's not, it's not an impossible thing, but they just have the I didn't want to vote box. I think none of the above is much stronger, because then you go, okay, none of you wanted, over 50% of you did not want any of these people. So we'll hold another election and nobody who stood before is allowed to stand. And that stops the party apparatus. It stops the party from stuffing the electoral roll with people that you've never seen and never heard of, but they want to get into part, which is exactly what's happening in the UK at the moment. Then you could go, no, we don't like those. Sorry, bugger off. Until you give us somebody that we actually know and that we want here, then we're not going to have those. And if you combine that with one of the intelligent variants on PR, then you can begin to get people who are voted in who are connected to the local community, but also have the power and the wisdom. There are a whole bunch of different ideas of how we could go about electing people that are actually much more intelligent than we do it now, that are much more place-based. And I could talk through any one of those in a few minutes if you want. There's a lot of people thinking about democracy, and there are a lot of ideas that work much, much, much better than what we have now. And I heard somebody last night, I went to a hustings last night, and somebody quoted Churchill, who said democracy is the worst option except for all the other options. That quote is over 100 years old, and it wasn't even true then. And Churchill was in many ways a complete monster. So, he did some good things and he did a lot of very, very, very bad things by anybody's lights. So let's stop quoting Churchill. Let's look at the better ways democracy could be organized, and let's find ways to make them happen. But we need to break the current system.
Yeah. And I think it's so true that there are people starting to talk about that, but there's been no true movement to reimagine democracy. And we need to do that. And I want to make a point, then bring Jim in here, is that somebody might be thinking, this is great, but the powerful, the ruthless will still find a way to win. But if you think about it, I don't know if you remember David Hawkins' work. Hawkins was a physician and psychologist who then became kind of a spiritual guru in the US. But he created this thing called the levels of consciousness that went from 0 to 1,000. And he said humanity's briefly went over 200, which is barely enlightened, and Jesus and Buddha are like 1,000. Anyway, but one of the things he said is that we can't change the world unless we change the level of consciousness. And when you said it has to be peaceful, I think that's so important, because let's think about two of the greatest changes of the last century. Gandhi
and Martin Luther King.
Gandhi, King, and Nelson Mandela. What did they all have in common? They
Yes.
gathered people in community to stand up for a different way, and the means mattered.
Yeah.
It was done with dignity, and it was done peacefully, and
Yes.
it raised the level of consciousness, probably even of those who were following them, who might have wanted in South Africa to get revenge, or in America to follow a more radical path,
Yeah.
or in India.
Or in
So I
India.
think that we have examples where we've been able to do that, and we have to remember that things have been transformed because
Yes.
people at another level of consciousness were able to do something. Jim, let me bring you in maybe, and then back to Amanda.
Amanda, I want to take us back up to 1,000 feet. You talked about we're in the middle of a hyper complex meta crisis. I want to look at the collapse literature. I know a lot of people are looking at the collapse literature, and we're seeing things like the great simplification and stuff like that. I want to make an argument that we do have possibilities. How do we make that argument that we just don't get ready for everything to collapse, but we still have an opportunity, a chance to address the complex meta crisis? What's the argument I make to people about that?
So I would say that there's two separate arguments and they overlap. One of them is the spiritual argument. In this shamanic work that I do, and we have a group that meets once a month who are shamanic teachers within the UK. So we're just checking out how everybody's doing. We are getting more help now than we have ever had. It's more overt, it's more obvious, and it's more obviously constructive. And I don't think we would be given the help if it were guaranteed that we were going over the edge of the cliff. So if there are people who are heart connected to the web of life, the web of life is a complex system. And I think if we orient towards life, Nate Hagen says in The Great Simplification, he's not, one wing or the other. He's just oriented towards complex life. And what happens when we orient towards complex life? What happens when we lift ourselves out of our Paleolithic emotions? What happens when we do that is we become different people. And I genuinely think there's a tipping point, an energetic tipping point, where enough of us step into heart mind. And James, that was where you were describing when you said you step into the moment and you wait for instinct to come and then you move with it. That for me is heart mind. We know how to do this. I think that's an absolute priority because the energetics of who we are shapes the energetics of the world around us. And it's one of the visions that I had that I didn't get to this winter solstice of 2018 was of the world, the blue pearl floating through the blackness of space, that famous picture that we saw when the moon landings happened, but it was surrounded by this extraordinary complex web of light. Moonlight when it's night and sunlight when it's daytime. And at every crossing point of all these extraordinary filaments of light, every crossing point is a node of consciousness. And some of those nodes are human and most of them are not. But every time a human steps into that node of consciousness in full awareness and connects to the web and goes, I am here in service, it makes a difference. And I think that's really important. And actually, I think it's more important than anything else, but it's also a narrative that will go over the heads of people who don't already have a spiritual practice. But if they do have a spiritual practice, I think the single most important thing you can do is slow down, balance on the knife edge of the moment, step into heart mind, come into full presence as your node on the web and ask, what do you need of me? And respond to that in real time. If we're going for a more conceptual head-mind based thought, then that's why I run the Accidental Gods podcast. We need to understand that the answers are in our hands. We need to stop with this bizarre deep adaptation narrative because I don't think it's useful. Yes, we might still go over the edge of the cliff. And yes, if we do that, it would be good to die with grace. We can set that intent and let it go because we're not there yet. And so what does the world look like if we were actually able to craft a future that we were proud to leave to the generations that come after us? I want 7 generations down the line, the people who are my age then, to look back at our generation and they will say, yes, they left it way too late. And they made a lot of mistakes along the way. But when it really mattered, they all got together and they looked forward and they crafted a future that would work. They laid the foundations for the future that I, the person 7 generations down the line, I'm living in. And this is a future that I am comfortable with. I wake up in the morning, I am confident, I am safe. I live in an abundant world of generosity and connection with the web of life. And this isn't I think there's a kind of middle class manifesting mindset, which drives me blinking crazy of, oh, the world is abundant and I can manifest a new private jet for myself. Stop. Please stop. That's a part of the really toxic trauma mindset. You do not need a private jet. There is not a single human being on the planet who needs a private jet. Just don't. But what we do need is to find out what is sufficiency. The narrative of the trauma culture is of separation, scarcity, and powerlessness. And hooking into that, even if we give it a deep adaptation spin, it's still scarcity, separation, and we're all going to die. And I think we have agency, connection, and sufficiency. And that there are so many people working on different economic models, different political models, different constitutional models, different ways of creating and distributing power. And all I've done with the book is take all of those and bring them together in the beginnings of a narrative. And we need those narratives. We need every writer who is listening to this, whether you write scripts or for TV or movies, or you write books, or you write poetry, or you write songs, or I don't care if you write TikTok videos or blogs or paper, letters to your local parish magazine. Write about how we make it through and what it looks like and what it feels like, and stop continuing the narratives of despair, because there is still time. We are the most creative we have ever been. We are the most connected as a species we have ever been. And creativity happens when we bring our connections together. We just need to bring them together with the concept that something different is possible, and we can do this.
You're talking about imagining the actual mechanics of how we do this.
Yes.
I want to highlight one point, is that it begins with us. It begins with us recognizing our own imagination and changing us. We have to be willing to be something else.
Yes, we have to let go of the dreams that you and I woke up with. This is why we call our podcast Accidental Gods. We did not grow up expecting to be the generation that was at the turning point and facing species level extinction. But here we are. We have godlike technology, and we need to change our aspirations, change what we think the world is, change what we've been told the world is, and reimagine in connection with the web of life what the world could be if we got it right.
It's almost as if the universe is calling us.
Yes, it really is.
To do that. And it's calling the baby boomers. We have one last act to play out. And that's to help the younger generation. And by changing our, it begins with us.
Yes.
So
well, it begins with everyone alive on the planet at the moment. And I would say Audrey Tang was invited to reverse mentor the person in government at the time. Audrey Tang was much younger. It was 2014. To be a reverse mentor, to be youth mentoring the old. And it would not hurt us of the boomer generation to take some reverse mentoring from the young people and ask, what do you need us to do?
We need to be their partners. We need to walk alongside them.
Be the elders when they need us to be, because there are insights that we can bring from our time on the planet. But we also need to be humble enough to realize that they can teach us stuff about technology, about ways of connecting, about ways of being in a world where they don't look forward and see 2.5 kids and a mortgage and a car. What does that feel like?
I love what you said. I think that the key thing is to be humble.
Humility actually comes from the word humus, to be in the ground, right? To like just go all the way to ground and be open and curious. I love something you said, Amanda, it's so beautiful about the kind of collapse concept. You said, let's agree we could go over the cliff. Let's set the intention, honest, deep intention that if we go over the cliff, we're going to do it with grace and openness and compassion, not fighting for the last drop. And then let's let that go.
Let it go.
And then you said we have the connectivity, the sufficiency, and I forget the third word.
Agency.
Yeah, agency. So we have the power, we have the sufficiency and the connectivity to do this. And we could go on all day, but unfortunately, time must always touch us lightly.
But thank you for the opportunity to share the ideas. Really, I'm so grateful.
So, Amanda, I'll ask you a question. I may already know the answer, but that we ask everyone at the end of our podcast or sometime during our podcast, which is, what gives you hope? So as you stop in this moment and think about us, what gives you hope?
Being alive gives me hope, but heart connection, every time I feel that burst of heart-bursting gratitude and awe at the world is so magical. If we let ourselves feel the awe, feel the gratitude, feel the connection to the web of life in all its astonishing mystery and beauty and connectedness, that gives me hope. Also, the God in the North.
Thank you so much. Amanda, is your book available in audio as well?
Yes, it's in audio, it's an ebook. It will only be in physical form in the US after the 7th of August. It's actually on a boat as you and I speak, I gather. It has to actually physically get there. We pushed the publication date of this as far as it could possibly go, just because I kept wanting to change stuff and update it. So after 7th of August, it's available in actual hard copy, but ebook and audiobook anytime now.
Right. And do you narrate it?
No. I can't do all the voices. I'm not.
Darn,
I can't do that.
It would be great to hear. But anyway, I'm going to download it immediately and start reading it. So first of all, thank you, Manda, not only for being with us today, but for the work that you're doing in the world, trying to raise your consciousness and the consciousness of others. And we need this kind of thinking. And so I really appreciate it. And, as I just reflect back on our podcast today, the thing that really strikes me the most is the two quotes. First, the one from E.O. Wilson. Say that again. E.O. Wilson
We have
said,
Paleolithic emotions and medieval institutions and the technology of gods, and this is not serving us well, but we can upgrade the first two of these to match the third.
And we have the agency, the sufficiency, and the connectivity to do this. And the only question is, are we going to step into it? And obviously, it begins always with ourselves. But we have examples. We talked about Gandhi and King. And by the way, it wasn't Gandhi. It's not King. It wasn't Nelson Mandela. They were the catalyst for a community of people. We forget that because we think, we need a great man or a great woman or a great they to come and save us. No, they will arrive if our consciousness will call it forth.
Yes. And there is still time. In your country and mine, there is time to change the electoral dynamics. There is still time. We could use this. We could make it happen. And actually, I think it's urgent. I don't know that we've got another electoral cycle to play with and still have time to make the difference that we need to make. So why not set that as an intent and see what happens?
I like it. Well, first of all, thank you again, Amanda, and thank you, our listeners. You're why we're here. If you love what you heard, please subscribe and pass it on to others. If you like what you heard, but think we could do better or have other topics and other guests, we'd love to hear from you. Meanwhile, as we always say at the end of this podcast, history is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. We are creating what will be called history by the way we act and choose to behave together and individually every day. We'll see you next time on The Way Forward.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You have many choices, and we appreciate your interest and support. We want to hear from you. Please reach out to us at thewayforwardrc@gmail.com with your thoughts and feedback. Your input helps us create a podcast that you want to listen to and share with your friends. If you have guest recommendations, we would love to hear those as well. A special thank you to our sponsors, Elders Climate Action and Elders Action Network, who are building a movement of elders to address the environmental, governance, and social issues of our time. You can learn more about their work at eldersaction.org and eldersclimateaction.org. Until next time, I'm Jim Burke, and this is the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can watch us on YouTube. In parting, may I wish you a regenerative present and future.